Pastor Williams slammed his Bible against the pulpit and pointed at the marble statue behind him. "This worthless stone and paint has deceived Catholics for centuries," he declared to his evangelical congregation. The Virgin Mary statue stood gracefully in the former Catholic church his denomination had purchased 6 months earlier, her serene face gazing down at the pews where generations of families once prayed the rosary. Now, those same families watched from the parking lot as their sacred space hosted services that mocked everything they held dear. Williams circled the statue like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "Look at this idol," he continued, his voice echoing off walls that still bore faded outlines where crucifixes once hung. His wife, Margaret, shifted uncomfortably in the front row, remembering her grandmother's devotion to Mary before she converted for marriage. Several long-time parishioners glanced at each other nervously as Williams grabbed the statue's marble base and shook it. "Tomorrow morning I will personally remove this false goddess from God's house," he announced triumphantly. The applause that followed felt forced, even desperate, as if his congregation was trying to convince themselves they were doing something righteous rather than something that made their hearts heavy with unspoken doubt about whether some sacred things should never be disturbed. Williams arrived at dawn with a crowbar and moving equipment, determined to fulfill his promise before anyone could protest. Margaret followed reluctantly, bringing coffee she knew he wouldn't drink in his current state of righteous fury. The morning light streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the marble statue that seemed to make Mary's face almost alive. As Williams positioned his crowbar against the base, something impossible happened. A single tear appeared in the corner of the Virgin's left eye, glistening like crystal in the dawn light. Then another, then a steady stream flowing down her carved cheek onto the altar below. Margaret gasped and dropped her coffee cup, the sound echoing through the empty sanctuary. Williams froze, crowbar suspended mid-swing, as more tears flowed from both eyes now. "This is humidity," he said, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. "Just moisture in the stone from temperature changes." But the tears continued, clear and warm to Margaret's trembling touch when she reached up to feel them. 3 early arriving parishioners entering for morning setup stopped in stunned silence, witnessing something that defied every rational explanation Williams had built his ministry upon. The marble wept as if a mother's heart was breaking, and everyone present knew they were seeing either the most elaborate hoax in church history or a miracle that would change everything they believed about the sacred and the impossible. By noon, the parking lot overflowed with cars as word spread through both communities like wildfire. Margaret had called her sister, who called Father Rodriguez at St. Catherine's across town, and within hours, former parishioners who had worshipped in this building for decades arrived to witness what they could hardly believe. The Gonzalez family knelt on the front steps, praying the rosary they hadn't said since the church was sold. Mrs. Chun wept openly as she touched the door she once entered every Sunday for 40 years. Inside, Williams paced frantically while the statue continued weeping, the tears now pooling on the altar cloth Margaret had embroidered last Christmas. His phone buzzed with calls from district headquarters demanding explanations he couldn't give. Deacon Barnes arrived with 3 other church leaders, their faces grim with determination to end what they called demonic deception. But when Barnes reached for the statue, his hand began shaking uncontrollably and he stumbled backward. The tears flowed heavier now, as if responding to the mounting tension between those who saw blasphemy and those who recognized something holy they had never expected to encounter. Williams' congregation split down the middle, half demanding immediate removal, while others whispered that maybe, just maybe, they had stumbled into something far bigger than their denominational training had prepared them to handle. That evening, as Williams tried to formulate a response to his increasingly agitated superiors, 17-year-old Sarah collapsed in their kitchen while helping Margaret prepare dinner. One moment, she was laughing about her college applications. The next, she lay unconscious on the linoleum floor, her breathing shallow and irregular. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital became Williams' new sanctuary of desperate prayer. Dr. Patterson ran every test available but found nothing wrong with Sarah's brain, heart, or blood chemistry. Her body simply refused to wake up, as if something vital had been switched off without explanation. Margaret held their daughter's limp hand while machines beeped steadily, marking time that felt suspended between hope and despair. By midnight, word had reached the Catholic families still gathered at the church. Mrs. Gonzalez arrived first, carrying a thermos of coffee and offering to sit with Margaret during the long vigil. Then came the Chins with homemade soup, followed by families Williams had barely spoken to during his 6 months in their former church building. These people whose faith he had mocked now surrounded his family with the kind of grace that made his theological certainties crumble into dust, their quiet prayers rising like incense around Sarah's hospital bed, while the Virgin Mary's tears continued flowing miles away. On the third night at Sarah's bedside, Margaret finally spoke the words that had been burning inside her chest. "I was raised Catholic, David." She stared at their daughter's pale face while the ventilator breathed for her. "My grandmother taught me to pray the rosary before you ever taught me Protestant theology, and seeing Mary weep brings back everything I buried when I married you." Williams felt the last foundation of his certainty crack beneath him. "You never told me this," he whispered, though some part of him had always sensed Margaret's complicated relationship with the statues and rituals he preached against. She had been too quick to agree with his sermons, too eager to prove her evangelical conversion was complete. "Maybe we've been fighting against God instead of for him," Margaret continued, her voice steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "These Catholic families praying for our daughter while their own church weeps for what we've destroyed, that's more Christianity than anything I've seen in our congregation's righteous anger." Williams pulled away from her touch, feeling betrayed and isolated as his world collapsed around him. 20 years of marriage built on assumptions he never questioned, a ministry founded on rejecting everything these humble families represented. And now his daughter lay dying while the Virgin Mary cried tears that defied every theological framework he had used to build his identity and his career. District Superintendent Morrison arrived Friday morning with a truck, heavy machinery, and 3 regional pastors determined to end what he called a satanic spectacle. Williams watched from the hospital window as they surrounded his former church with equipment designed to remove the weeping statue by force. His phone buzzed with Morrison's ultimatum: handle this situation or lose your ministry credentials permanently. But every piece of machinery failed in ways that defied mechanical logic. The crane's hydraulics burst without warning, spilling fluid across the parking lot where Catholic families continued their prayer vigil. Industrial saws sparked and died when they touched the statue's base. Even simple hand tools slipped from workers' grips as if the marble had become untouchable. Morrison grew increasingly frustrated as his team reported equipment malfunctions that made no engineering sense. The statue continued weeping throughout the attempted removal, tears flowing heavier each time someone approached with destructive intent. By afternoon, 3 workers had quit after experiencing what they described as overwhelming dread whenever they tried to damage Mary's carved features. Williams felt his denominational ties severing with each failed attempt to destroy something that refused to be destroyed. Morrison's final phone call was brief and brutal. "You have 24 hours to remove that idol, or we remove you from ministry." But as Sarah lay unconscious and the Virgin wept, Williams began wondering if losing everything he had built might be the price of discovering something eternal he had never understood. At midnight on the 7th day, Williams found himself alone in the church sanctuary, his rational worldview shattered beyond repair. Sarah's condition had worsened despite every medical intervention, and Margaret had stopped speaking to him after he refused to acknowledge what the Catholic families called miracle. His ministry hung by a thread, his marriage was crumbling, and his daughter lay dying while he clung to theological pride that felt increasingly hollow. He knelt before the weeping statue for the first time in his life, his knees hitting the marble floor where generations of Catholics had prayed before him. The tears continued flowing down Mary's carved face, catching moonlight from the stained glass windows like liquid starlight. His voice cracked as words he had never expected to speak escaped his lips. "I don't know how to talk to you," he whispered to the marble figure. "My daughter is dying, and I've spent 20 years telling people you're just stone and paint. But these tears are real, and my pride is killing everything I love. If you can hear me, if there's something sacred I've been too blind to see, please don't let Sarah pay for my arrogance." The church fell silent except for the gentle sound of tears dropping on an altar cloth, and Williams wept alongside the Virgin Mary, his theological certainties dissolving into desperate prayer for grace he had never learned to request from a mother he had never acknowledged. Sarah opened her eyes at dawn, her first words asking for water and wondering why everyone was crying. Dr. Patterson ran every test twice, finding no medical explanation for her complete recovery from a condition that had baffled his entire team. Margaret collapsed into grateful sobs while Williams stared at his daughter's clear eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that his midnight prayer had been answered by someone he had spent 20 years denying. Within hours, Williams was in Father Rodriguez's office, asking questions that would have horrified his denominational supervisors. "Tell me about Mary," he said simply. "Tell me what I've been missing." Rodriguez opened centuries of Marian theology with the patience of someone who had prayed for this conversation, explaining intercession, the communion of saints, and devotions that enriched rather than replaced Christ-centered faith. Williams' sermons became tentative explorations rather than confident proclamations. He spoke about mystery, about divine love working through unexpected channels, about the difference between worshiping Mary and honoring her role in salvation history. Half his congregation left within 2 weeks, unable to follow their pastor's theological journey away from the certainties that had defined their identity. But those who remained began discovering faith layers their Protestant education had never revealed, finding richness in traditions they had been taught to fear, and experiencing God's grace flowing through channels their denominational training had declared impossible or even dangerous. The following Sunday, Williams stood before the largest congregation he had ever addressed, composed of both his remaining evangelical parishioners and dozens of Catholic families who had returned to their former church building. His voice trembled as he spoke words that would define his ministry's new direction. "I publicly apologize to every Catholic family whose sacred traditions I mocked from this pulpit," he began. "My arrogance blinded me to the divine grace flowing through devotions I was too proud to understand. The Virgin Mary's tears taught me that God's love works through channels my theological education never acknowledged, and my daughter's healing proved that intercession I called false was actually opening doors to miracles I was too stubborn to recognize." Father Rodriguez joined him at the pulpit, announcing an unprecedented partnership between St. Catherine's and Williams' congregation. They would share the building that had housed Catholic worship for 60 years before denominational divisions forced its sale. Sunday morning would remain evangelical service, while weekday masses would resume in the sanctuary where Mary's statue still occasionally wept. Some evangelical parishioners walked out during the announcement, unable to accept what they saw as theological compromise. But others stayed, drawn by curiosity about faith traditions they had been taught to fear. The Gonzalez family embraced Margaret after service, welcoming her home to the Catholic community she had abandoned 20 years earlier, while Sarah helped arrange flowers around the weeping statue that had saved her life and transformed her father's heart. Within months, the church became a pilgrimage destination, drawing visitors from across the country who came to witness the weeping statue and hear the story of denominational walls crumbling through divine intervention. Williams worked alongside Catholic volunteers every weekend, restoring religious artwork that had been covered or removed during the evangelical renovation. His hands, once raised in mockery, now carefully cleaned centuries-old Stations of the Cross and repaired damaged stained glass that told Mary's story in brilliant colored light. The shrine they built around the weeping statue became a place where Protestant and Catholic families prayed together, sharing devotions that enriched rather than threatened each tradition. Margaret taught rosary classes while Williams led Bible studies that explored Marian passages he had previously ignored. Sarah, now fully recovered and passionate about theology, served as tour guide for pilgrims who came seeking their own encounters with grace that transcended denominational boundaries. The statue continued weeping occasionally, usually when families facing division knelt before it seeking healing for relationships fractured by religious differences. Each tear seemed to wash away another layer of prejudice that had separated Christian communities for centuries. William's ministry had evolved from preaching against Catholicism to demonstrating how evangelical and Catholic faith could strengthen each other when pride and fear were replaced by humility and wonder at God's mysterious ways of working through unexpected channels. The transformation rippled through families that had been divided by denominational loyalty for generations. The Chin family reunited with their evangelical son who had left Catholicism in college, while the Protestant Martinez children began attending their grandmother's rosary circle for the first time since childhood. Williams watched these reconciliations with wonder, realizing that Mary's tears had washed away more than his own pride. They had dissolved barriers that had kept Christian families from fully loving each other across traditional lines. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Williams and Margaret renewed their marriage vows in a ceremony that honored both faith traditions. Father Rodriguez offered the Catholic blessing while Williams spoke evangelical promises, creating a celebration that neither denomination could have imagined before the Virgin Mary wept for their divided hearts. Margaret wore her grandmother's rosary alongside her wedding ring, symbols of faith journeys that no longer competed but complemented each other in ways that made their love deeper and more honest. Sarah announced her calling to bridge-building ministry, planning to study both Protestant and Catholic theology in preparation for healing work between Christian communities worldwide. As she spoke about her future, the Virgin Mary statue gently wept again, tears catching candlelight from votive offerings left by families whose own divisions were healing through witnessing grace that flowed freely between traditions once considered incompatible. 1 year after the Virgin Mary first wept, William stood at the podium of the National Christian Unity Conference, sharing his transformation story with denominational leaders from across the country. His message was simple: divine grace flows through channels we often fear to explore, and miracles happen when pride gives way to humble recognition that God's love transcends our theological boundaries. The Church thrived as a model of ecumenical cooperation, hosting retreats where Protestant and Catholic families learned from each other's spiritual traditions without abandoning their own identity. William's ministry had evolved into something he never could have imagined during his days of denominational certainty, becoming a bridge between communities that had viewed each other with suspicion for centuries. The Virgin Mary statue still occasionally wept, usually during moments when pilgrims experienced their own encounters with grace that challenged everything they thought they knew about faith, forgiveness, and the mysterious ways divine love works through unexpected interventions. Sarah, now in seminary, served as living testimony that healing from religious division was possible when hearts opened to wonder rather than closed in fear. If you've experienced moments when grace surprised you through traditions different from your own, or witnessed healing that brought divided families back together, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful testimonies come from ordinary people who discovered extraordinary love flowing through channels they never expected to explore.